The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, prepared the way for the Advent message and the proclamation of the everlasting gospel. Here's just kind of a summary of that. You know, the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, and this was all in preparation for the Second Advent movement. Some of the people that took part in that, Miller, of course, was the main one. You have Bates, these are different men and women that were involved in that. And here's a statement from Ellen White. She says, "We have nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history." And so it's a two-pronged effect here for a message. Number one is history, and the other is a message. And both of those came together from 1844 until 1888. In 1852, Ellen White began writing first letter of messages to the Laodicean church. And she said, James White in 1855, both of them said the Advent believers, now these were Seventh-day Adventists, they were Seventh-day believers. We were not organized at this time as a church, but they said, we are Laodicean. And this sent shockwaves into the ranks of the believers because they believed that they were Philadelphia. And Philadelphia was the one that went through up until Miller, the Advent movement, or 1844. And so the Adventists the Seventh-day people became shocked to learn that they were Laodicean. They didn't want to believe it. But a revival took place among them. And then you had James White in 1855, just a small blurb in the back of the Review and Herald. It says, we are in a Laodicean state. And then by 1859, Ellen White says, we had hoped that the loud cry would have begun by this time. And you can find this in volume 1 of the testimony, probably about 186 to 189. And in this, in fact, I think I've got a statement, this next one is, in 59, Mrs. White wrote that nearly all Sabbath-keeping Adventists believed that this message, and this was the message to Laodicea, would end in the loud cry of the third angel. That was by 1859. And so I believe the Lord would have come even before we were organized as a church. If, especially the Millerite movement had swung into that. It didn't happen, and then something else was going on outside of Adventism. I call it the Million Soul Revival. It started in New York City. It started with, I think, about 3 men, and then it went from 3 to 6 to 50,000 men were praying daily. 10,000 conversions per week. 1 million were converted in North America by March of 1858, so within about a year's time. And in 1857, there was a financial crisis. And one man went to the pastor of the Fulton Church and on Fulton Street, and he asked if they could open the church at noon for a prayer meeting. And it was allowed, and then the three began to meet. Others started coming, and then there were daily meetings, and the revival soon spread to other cities, Philadelphia, Boston, to other cities and towns in the United States. The secular papers even wrote about it. It was a tremendous movement. Here, this is called the Third Great Awakening in 57 to 59, was noted by the secular newspapers for its quiet orderliness everywhere. While through it, more than 1 million converts were added to the churches. Now, in this, I don't think there was any preaching. It was Bible study and prayers. And the church historians, the Protestant church historians, have no clue as to what was going on. They say, we can't understand why it began, we don't know why it ended. But Ellen White gave a clear indication of something going on. She says, angels were sent in every direction to prepare unbelieving hearts for the truth. The cause of God began to rise, and his people were acquainted with the position. If the counsel of the true witness had been fully heeded, God would have wrought for his people in greater power. Now, I read earlier where she said that they had hoped that this message would end in the loud cry, and that's the preparation for the coming Christ. It didn't happen, and when it didn't happen within the believing ranks, it died out outside of Adventism too. That Million Soul Revival went down the tube. And God is, if
He would have probably come, wouldn't he?
oh, he would have come, yeah. Yeah. Someone said, well, we wouldn't be there, but we wouldn't know about it either. So, anyhow, then by 1863, we were organized as a church. And at the same year, 1863, there was a movement called the National Reform Movement. It began in Xenia, Ohio. And they were pushing for law, Sunday laws. This was the beginning, but as they picked up steam, it came to a head in 1888. Now, before this happened, E.J. Waggoner was in a tent meeting. I've got his experience. It'll come a little bit later. But Ellen White was preaching the tent meeting, and he said he doesn't remember what the message was about, but he had a picture of Christ dying for him. And he was converted during that meeting. And we'll come back to it a little bit later. In 1887, there was conflict between the Signs of the Times and the Review and Herald. Jones and Waggoner were associate editors of Signs of the Times. Uriah Smith was the editor of the Review and Herald. Jones and Waggoner began to present concepts from the book of Galatians, saying that the law in Galatians was the moral law. Or they said it was a ceremonial also, but it was primarily the moral law. And Butler, who was the General Conference president, and Smith began to react to that. And Ellen White wrote, if you have there's 4 volumes called 1880 Materials, written by Ellen White, 4 black volumes, and all the statements in there relate to 1888. Anything that Ellen White wrote about it, they put that together. And they did this in 1988 for the centennial celebration. But the first letter in that book, first chapter, first letter, was written to Jones and Waggoner. And Ellen White rebuked them. She said, you men should not be agitating or doing this sort of thing. They were in the Signs of the Times, Review and Herald, and they were going back and forth on the law and Galatians and other things. And so usually what she did, if she sent a rebuke to one person or whatever, or a church, she would send it to leadership. So she sent the letter, a copy of the letter, to Jones and Waggoner, to Butler and Smith. And they said, aha, she's on our side. And so they started building on that. And she said, and Butler became pretty bitter. He wrote a book on called the Law and Galatians. And he said it was all ceremonial. And Waggoner wrote a letter to him, and just point by point, just took it apart. But the heat was there, and so Ellen White rebuked Butler and Smith for what they were doing, and she says now Dr. Waggoner needs to have opportunity to speak his position, and so that's what led up to 1888, and that's the reason they spoke at 1888. And of course, some accepted, but not very many. It was a tremendous struggle at that time. But before the meeting took place, there was what was in May of 1888, there was what was known as the Blair Sunday Law, or Bill. And it dealt with it in May and December of 1888. Remember, 1863 is when the National Reform Movement began. And it began to pick up speed as time went on. The Temperance Society, they joined it. And many of the Sunday-keeping churches got on, were pushing it. So we're a Christian nation, and we need to have a Christian day of worship. And of course, the Adventists were not in tune with that. But after, I should say, in May of, I think, this next one here, this is what they said. They said, the desire of this group and others were, we need a Sabbath. They were talking about Sunday. We need a Sunday law that will bind the government and the corporation as well as the individual. And this was written in 1884. So in May of that year, May 21st, the Sunday law bill was introduced by Senator Blair from New Hampshire. And the word that that they were pushing was that it would promote, it doesn't have much teeth in it, but they wanted to promote Sunday sacredness. And this is part of it here. May 21, 1888, this is the 50th Congress, first session. Blair introduced in the Senate the following bill. A bill to secure to the people the enjoyment of the first day of the week, commonly known as the Lord's Day, as a day of rest, and to promote its observance as a day of religious worship. And then there's 6 sections that follow that introduction. Now, then they recessed shortly after this. December, they came back, and it's very much like what happens today. Politicians go on, they go home, and then they come back and try to finish whatever work is left undone. But anyhow, on the 13th of December, the session began, and they changed the word from promoting to protecting. Now we're getting some teeth into that message, or into that law. And this, as I said, this is the second session of the 50th Congress that had convened. And a hearing was requested in which the Blair Sunday Bill was urged for passage. And this is where the Temperance League came in. This is Batum from the Women's Christian Temperance Union asked for the following change in the Blair Bill. A bill to secure to the people the enjoyment of the Lord's Day, commonly known as Sunday, as a day of rest, and to protect its observance as a day of worship. But between these 2 sessions, something happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And that is the message of 1888 that came to the forefront. General Conference was convened in Minneapolis, and this is a picture of the church, and there are about 100, maybe 98, 97 delegates to that conference. And this is a group picture of them. Now, the GC, the GC Institute, this preceded the General Conference itself, and this is where people would study. Jones and Waggoner were presenting some concepts here. And then on the 17th, then the regular General Conference session began, and it continued on to November 4. Now, what had happened in Minneapolis, Ellen White is looking back at this, and she said, the time of test is just upon us. Now, the test would be the Sunday law. She says, for the loud cry of the third angel has already begun in the revelation of the righteousness of Christ, the sin pardoned Redeemer. We'll come back a little bit later and finish the paragraph on this, but this is the 2 things she mentioned, the time of test and then the loud cry. And the loud cry is to prepare that test that would come upon us through the Sunday legislation. And but very clear, she said that the loud cry began in the Minneapolis meetings. Now, it was not accepted fully. There were a few men that did it. Even W.W. Prescott actually fought against it to begin with. Then he came on board and became a very strong proponent of it. And there were others the same thing happened. Here's a picture of the 2 men as they were young, in their 30s. Jones and Waggoner were the ones that began, and they probably didn't even know at that time that God was directing these things. But this is Waggoner's part of his testimony for his conversion. He says, many years ago, the writer sat in a tent one that dismal, rainy afternoon, where a certain servant of the Lord was presenting the gospel of his grace, and that person was Ellen White. Not a word of the text or the text used, nor what was said by the speaker, has remained with me, and I have never been conscious of having heard a word. But in the midst of the discourse, an experience came to me that was the turning point in my life. Suddenly, a light shone upon me, and the tent seemed illumined, as though the sun was shining. I saw Christ crucified for me, and to me was revealed for the first time in my life the fact that God loved me, and that Christ gave himself for me personally. It was all for me. If I could describe my feelings, they would not be understood by those who have not had a similar experience, and no such explanation is necessary for those who did have that experience. And this is found in a book called The Everlasting Covenant This one was written in 1900. There's another one that's been published that used some of the same material. He wrote this while he was in England. Well, actually he started here in the United States. And then he went to England as editor of the Present Truth magazine over there. And then he started writing about the everlasting covenant that went all the way from Eden in the beginning to Eden restored. And again, I want to come back to Ellen White's statement. She says, the time of test is just upon us, for the loud cry of the third angel has already begun in the revelation of the righteousness of Christ, the sin-pardoning Redeemer. This is the beginning of the light of the angel whose glory shall fill the whole earth. And this is talking about now chapter 18 of Revelation. The first word says that the glory of God filled the entire earth. Then the next, verse 2 says, Babylon has fallen. Verse 4 says, come out of my people. So this is what the loud cry would have done. It would call all of God's people out of every system in the world at that time. So, because the movement began to falter within Adventism, God had to stop the Sunday. You see that? Yeah.
I did. God had to do what?
He had to stop the Sunday law bill, the bill that they're trying to pass for as a law. Now, we mentioned about Mrs. Bainham, who was the head of the Temperance Society. Ellen White belonged to that too. She spoke with him for many, many times. And there were several Adventists that belonged to it. But when they started pushing for the Sunday law in 1888, then they began to back away. And but anyhow, because God's people were not getting ready for the coming of Christ, that law had to be stopped. And so A.G. Jones was sent to Washington. He was our religious liberty director at that time. And he was sent to Washington to contest the Blair Sunday Bill. The Seventh-day Baptists were there also. But they said they would compromise. And the idea was they requested the following addition to the bill. In Section 7, any person that has habitually and conscientiously refrained from all labor on Saturday, believing that to be the Sabbath, shall on proof thereof be exempt from the penalties of this law, provided he has not on Sunday interfered with the rights of others to a day for rest and worship. Now this is the Seventh-day Baptist. Jones jumped all over the word exempt. But it wasn't the Baptists only. It was some of the politicians were saying, well, we can have an exemption for Seventh-day Adventists and Seventh-day Baptists. And this would have been dangerous if it had been allowed. So Jones objected to the whole idea of exemption. And in his book called The Two Republics, where he compared Rome and the United States, it was a history book, and he put a copy of the transcript of the proceedings in Washington, D.C. On page 849, we read Jones' insight as to the issues involved in the idea of exemption as put forth by the advocates of the Sunday law bill. He says, if the law be just, there can be no just exemption. If the law is right, exemption is wrong. And if the exemption is right, then the law is wrong. Therefore, their offer and advocacy of exemption is an open confession that the law is unjust, and that under the law, without the exemption, the people will be denied the equal protection of the laws. Yet, though this be true, the exemption is neither offered nor advocated upon principle, but solely for policy's sake. And Jones alone, now he went, now I think the Seventh-day Baptists, they only had about 5 minutes. And I think that's all the time Jones had to begin with. But because the Seventh-day Baptists had run out of steam, they were only asking for an exemption, so they gave the rest of the time to Jones. And Jones didn't have a book, he didn't have any information with him, everything came out of his head. But it was so powerful that Senator Blair said, I want you to come back in the afternoon, which he did. He brought the books with him at that time, and he just went through step by step what was wrong with the bill and why it should not be passed. And he convinced Blair to drop it. It was dropped. Then the pushers for it, the religious people, were absolutely furious with it. And Then, this is what Ellen White said. She says, in the startling significance of the movements now in progress, and that would be that reform movement, in regard to the religious amendments, if they had been realized by our brethren in every church, if they had discerned in these movements the plain direct fulfillment of prophecy, calling upon them to arouse to the demands of the crisis, they would not now be in such a stupor and death-like slumber. So this was in 5T 719. This was published in 1889. This was a time right in the middle of this crisis. And then she goes on, she says, we must show to the world that we recognize in the events that are now taking place in connection with the national reform movement, the fulfillment of prophecy. That which we have for the last 30 or 40 years proclaimed would come is now here. And the trumpet of every watchman upon the walls of Zion should raise the alarm. This was again written in 1889, January. This is right after the meeting in Minneapolis. But many of the men did not recognize this as a fulfillment of prophecy. Because they were so bound up on the debate issue that came out of 1888 and even before that. Now, on February 18, 1890, a hearing was held before the House Committee on the Breckenridge Bill. This was another bill that was coming in. He was represented from Kentucky, and he introduced a bill designed to prevent anyone from being forced to labor on Sunday within the District of Columbia. Jones saw what was going on here, and he jumped all over that too. SDAs, there were three men, I think, at that time. Jones was the spokesman, and their testimony was so powerful that the politicians came to them after their meeting, shook their hands. They said, we're thankful for what you men have said. Your logic was good, your reasoning was good, and we believe you. And the thing was dropped. They didn't push it. It talks about the people that it should have stopped pretty soon. I should have turned it off. The people that were pushing this thing, they just sneaked away. It reminded me of things that happened in Jesus' day. You know, they'd start arguing with him, and he would take their own arguments and kind of beat them over the head, and they would just melt away. Didn't have any more argument. And I think that's what happened there. And the Adventists pointed out that it was deceptive because one was being compelled to labor on Sunday. The real purpose of the bill was to force people to rest on Sunday. And the bill appeared to be just an initial step on the pathway of religious legislation toward complete Sunday laws. And I think there's, here, I think it's got, two other men. And then Jones, the last paragraph, spoke powerfully against the bill's constitutionality. The House Committee recognized the bill was religious in nature in violation of the First Amendment. The bill was defeated. And this is from, Elder Olson was the president of the General Conference at this time. And there's a meeting right here in Battle Creek. And he wrote about this. He wrote to one of the pastors. He said, Brother Jones stated that he had never realized the blessing of God in such a measure as when he spoke before the committee of the House in the last hearing. He said it seemed as though the sentences he should speak were written on the wall or suspended in the air before him. And it was not only they themselves that felt that they had a blessing, but all who were present could appreciate and realize that the power of God was there in a marked manner. Remarkable manner. All these things are encouraging indications. And this was a letter that he had written to G.C. Tenney. If you have the book, or you're going to get it, the book, Return of the Latter Rain, this is recorded in there. It's about, I think it's page 441, I think. I didn't write it down, but no. Then Ellen White said this was 1901, going ahead a little bit. We may have to remain here in this world because of insubordination many more years, as did the children of Israel. But for Christ's sake, his people should not add sin to sin by charging God with the consequence of their own wrong courses of action. So she's dealing with that issue. Had the purpose of God been carried out by his people in giving to the world the message of mercy, Christ, ere this, would have come to the earth, and the saints would have been received their welcome into the city of God. And I believe this would have taken place. Now, she's writing this in 1900, but this would have taken place, I believe, somewhere in the 1890s. If you go back to when she said that they hoped that the loud cry would begin in the 1850s, there was a period of time, say from 1855, it could have been earlier, but 1855 to 1859 was about 4 years. And if that message had gone, the loud cry did not begin, but it did begin in 1888. And had it been accepted, this thing would have been over with, at least by the turn of the century. But I think it would have been somewhere in the mid-1890s. But, so we're still wandering in the wilderness. But there's some good news, though, that something's happening in our church in North America. I don't know what's going on overseas. I know there's a lot of studying going on. But we're getting the pastors. I think I mentioned to you earlier that some of you may have seen this on the Michigan website. The last ministers' meeting in January, the man who wrote Return to the Latter Rain was there. He gave a statement primarily on the history, some of the stuff we're going over, but he had much more. The history of what had happened during that period of time. And it was so powerful that I think it was the fifth session, this weeping broke out. People were on their knees, some were confessing sins to one another. These were preachers, and two of the men in the conference leadership were doing the same thing. It was powerful. This has spread out over. Others have been looking at this thing, and I'm hoping that it will continue. But there may be a pushback, and maybe sometimes there's always opposition, but one day this thing is going to go, and it has to go, that we might be prepared for what's coming on the earth. The United States is falling apart. Have you recognized that? It's amazing the things that happen. We're seeing mobs and things like that in the streets, in the universities. This is going to spread throughout the United States before it's over with. And we're there. So we need to know Christ and what his message is. So Revelation 18:4 this is the message that they would bring you. It's not an addition. Well, yeah, it would be it's the same message of the 3 angels message of chapter 14, but more emphasis for the crisis. And what might have been will be. The loud cry will be heeded. Christ will return, and his people will receive the city of God. It is coming. And we need to remember that the majority of God's people are still found in Babylon. So his call to come out will be answered by the message of Christ and his righteousness in the setting of the end time. In Revelation chapter 4, where this is. And questions come, which way? By what teaching? By what power? And the answer is, Christ says, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the power. And when he is lifted up, and people see that he is the way, the truth, and the life, people will respond, I'm sure, if we're ready. Now here is, speaking about the most important meeting. We are impressed that this gathering will be the most important meeting that you've ever attended. And this was written before the meeting itself. All selfish ambition should be laid aside, and you should plead with God for the Spirit to descend upon you as it came upon the disciples who were assembled together on the day of Pentecost. And this was written to the men in the General Conference in 1888, August 1888. This was just before the meetings began, a couple months before. You can find that in 1880 materials, 38 through 41. Then the loud cry and the latter rain, they go together. The Spirit which characterized that wonderful meeting on the day of Pentecost is waiting to manifest its power upon the men who are now standing between the living and the dead as ambassadors for God. The power which stirred the people so mightily in the 1844 movement will again be revealed. The third angel's message will go forth, not in whispered tones, but with a loud voice. Now that doesn't mean shouting, but the power of God is going to be there, it's going to move people. And that's from volume 5, 252. But it's going to be a powerful message. Or it is a powerful message. When the Spirit was poured out from on high, the church was flooded with light. But Christ was the source of that light. His name was on every tongue. His love filled every heart. When the Spirit was poured out from on high. Oh, what happened here? I'm missing one. Oh, sorry. Oh, here. This is the conclusion. So it will be when the angel that comes down from heaven, having great power, shall lighten the whole earth with his glory. So she's comparing Pentecost with the last day movement. And here, this is something that Jones had to say. He said the message would go 10 times power. He said this latter rain will come as suddenly as it did in 44 and with 10 times the power. And he was referring to a statement by Ellen White. And when I read that, I said, I've got to find that. And I searched for years. I could not find it. And I thought it was one of those apocryphal statements that they're credited to Ellen White. But one day I was reading in Spalding and McGann's manuscripts, in their collection, and this, quoting her, she said, I saw the latter rain was coming as the midnight cry and with 10 times the power. So this is where he got that idea. And in 1844, this message went to every missionary station in the world, without exception. And people were awake and ready at that time, but the disappointment came and fizzled. Now, this is what she has to say about what will happen in our day. I believe it's going to happen. She said, there will be thousands converted to the truth in a day. With the 11th hour, see and acknowledge the truth and the movements of the Spirit of God. The accessions to the truth will be of a rapidity which will surprise the church. That's the 11th hour, just before, and I think the prophecy of Jesus, you know, the laborers who were working all day long got angry because of the one that came in on the 11th hour. But this is what's going to happen, I believe. Then she said the thought, and this comes to the message now, the thought that the righteousness of Christ is imputed to us, not because of any merit on our part, but as a free gift from God, is a precious thought. The enemy of God and man is not willing that this truth should be clearly presented, for he knows that if the people receive it fully, his power will be broken. That is why we have so many problems in the world. The devil knows the curtain for him as soon as this message enters into the experience of God's people. It needs to be intellectually accepted and a heart response to it. And in this, she says, she says, if you would stand through the time of trouble, you must know Christ and appropriate the gift of his righteousness, which he imputes to the repentant sinner. So this is the kind of an outline of what we've looked at. We looked at primarily the history, but we'll get into the theology of this also. It takes both. She said, we have nothing to fear for the future, except we forget the way the Lord has led us in the past and his clear teaching. And so we'll get into we'll be touching on the history all the way through here, but we'll get to the meat of the message itself, which is Christ and his righteousness, the faith of Jesus, Revelation 14:12. And with that, I think we'll stop